أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. I seek refuge in Allah from the accursed shaitan. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most merciful, especially merciful. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. We ask Allah to place blessings and salutations on Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Wasfiya Al-Talib and I warmly welcome you on behalf of Muslims Connected to tonight's webinar, which will be on teenagers, parenting and teenagers. Before we start, I would just like to let you know about another upcoming program that we're going to be having, and that is Pearls of Surah Yasin. And that will be a 6-week course from the 20th of June until the 24th of August at 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. South African time. And that will also be via Zoom, and it's going to be free, so please sign up for it. What will be covered will be understanding the surah, word for word translation. You'll be understanding it from a spiritual and linguistic perspectives, and obviously gain all the lessons and the benefits of this oft recited surah that we are encouraged to memorize as well. You can reach us on WhatsApp. You should have our number. You can DM us on Instagram. Please follow us on Instagram at Muslims_connected if you're not already following us. And also please subscribe to the YouTube channel where you will be able to watch all of our past free webinars as well. And then we're on Facebook, of course, as well. So do follow us over there. For tonight, our topic, as you all know, is My Teen and Me, and this will be facilitated or presented by clinical psychologist Sister Zorina Noordien. So to let you know a little bit about her, Sister Zorina Noordien is a clinical psychologist, and she's currently lecturing psychology students at the undergraduate level and clinical psychology at the master's level, while pursuing her PhD in child and adolescent mental health. Her experience includes working in a psychiatric facility for children and adolescents. And I might add as well that she is also a mother of teenagers herself. So I'm sure she will be speaking from experience as well, which is absolutely amazing to share with us. And also Masood and I had the opportunity to meet her while we were in Cape Town not too long ago. Alhamdulillah, Masood and I are back in Cairo, Egypt, and settled back in here. So yes, without any further ado, I'm going to be handing over to Sister Zorina Noordien to present the topic, My Teen and Me.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to everyone joining this evening. Thank you for the warm welcome, Wasfiya. It was a pleasure to meet both of them a few months ago, and I appreciate them welcoming back and allowing me the space to share. So this evening, I've got quite an intensive and hopefully comprehensive package on My Teen and Me and navigating relationships with your teenagers. I want to say first off that that's not all-inclusive, that there are definitely areas that with the time limit that I'm not able to cover and go into in more depth. And I'd also encourage you to let us know via the chat if there are other talks on certain areas that you feel you'd like more time on. Just let us know in the chat, and then I'll speak to Wasfiya and Masood about maybe in the future presenting on it. But for this evening, I imagine that most of you are joining because you either have teenagers, parents of teenagers, family members of teenagers, children that are going into their teenage years, or you might just be interested in this topic. I hope you find it informative. I also hope that you are able to take away what's useful for you, because not all of it may be. So take away what's useful and discard whatever doesn't fit. I want to say before I start this that I'm going to be talking a lot about typical teenage behavior, but I understand that might not necessarily apply to you and your teen. And so for you to understand that these typical behaviors do not mean that there's anything wrong with your teen or your communication or how things work in your family. It's just something to base information on. So I'm going to get started now because, like I said, I have quite a lot to cover. My intention, inshallah, is to finish at 9 o'clock and allow some time for questionings, and I'll do the best I can without going through things too rapidly so that I miss you, and that we're able to, generate some discussion or some questions about this when I am done presenting. But let me get started. Okay, so as Wasfia said, that my interest in teenage years, particularly I'm interested in child and adolescent mental health, but teenagers in particularly, because as a therapist working with teens, as an academic, but also as a mother of teens myself. And so when I put this together and thought about it, I thought about it from all those perspectives, with the hope that what I share with you is accessible and digestible and useful. And so the reason I'm focusing on teens, I think, just to give you a little background, is that it is a very challenging and exciting period of life. There is rapid growth and development, and it can be both very joyful experience, but it also can be very daunting. And my hope is to help you establish or maintain good relationships with your teen, and to give you some suggestions on how you may do that, but also give you an understanding of what life might be like from your teen's perspective. So we were all teenagers at some point. For some of us, it's further back to remember than others. And it's also important to bear in mind and think about what life was like for you as a teen, but also to recognize that the world that our teenagers are living in right now is very different, and no more so than during the last 2.5 years. So the outline for the evening is around understanding your teen, establishing and maintaining a connection, healing and repairing connection and relationships, and co-regulation. So in terms of understanding your teen, for me, it's important that we can think about children and development and teenagers in context. Children do not grow up in isolation. They are part of a family system. They are part of a community, a bigger society, and a country. And I think it's important that we contextualize our teens' experiences across these different platforms in order to understand the world they're living in. And the reason for this is that context matters. And so I'm going to share with you, and we don't have to go into too much detail with this, but just to give you like a visual sense of what I mean by the world, the ever-growing world that our children are exposed to. So as infants, their world is really small. It's the primary caregiver, which is the mother or the parent, whoever's looking after them. And as they grow up and get older, their world expands. And so they go to creche, they go to madrasa, they interact with extended families, with people in their neighborhood. And as they get older, they continue to engage in these different systems, and the world continues to grow. And so they both influenced and can influence the systems they are within. And what I mean by this is that what happens, and I think we can understand with the last 2 years in the pandemic, what happens at a societal level impacts the child as an individual. And I think that I would have been remiss not to contextualize the last 2.5 years, both for parents and for children, and what it can mean in terms of their development and how it could have impacted them. So with that in mind, with respect to adolescence, especially, the impact of COVID may have resulted in developmental interruptions. So your teenager could have been preteen prior to COVID, going into their teenage years, or were a teenager during COVID. And I think it's important to think about what that meant for them, that during these crucial developmental years, there was developmental interruptions and losses, especially in terms of their social emotional learning. So the teens that are meant to navigate, and we'll go through this in more detail in a while, that are meant to navigate their social relationships. That's important for the development. Those interactions were not possible because of the global pandemic. And to understand the impact of this on teen mental health. Recent studies have especially pointed out that there's been an increase of depression and anxiety among teenagers. And so this has been globally, but also in South Africa. And it's really interesting that this has impacted girls and young women more so than boys. So when you're thinking about your girl children, you also have to think about what the potential mental health challenges that they're dealing with as a result of this global pandemic. And sometimes adults could underestimate the impact. I think it's especially true now that most restrictions, if not all restrictions, have been lifted. And there's this talk about going to the new normal. To think about what that means and how your teen understands what that means, but also what they were left with not post-pandemic because we're still in it, but just the heart of it. Because I'd imagine that the impact of it was, both very overt in terms of losses of loved ones, but also there might have been a subtle impact in terms of negotiation of spaces and voices and relationships at school with peers, with parents and families. I don't think any of us are not impacted by the pandemic, but it's especially important for parents now of teenagers to think about what the effect has been on their teen and how it might be showing up. So also then to adjust the expectation of the teen and of yourself in relation to the pandemic, bearing in mind these developmental interruptions. So one way, and that contributed for most people that resulted, from the pandemic was an activation of stress. And it's interesting to know that psychological stress activates the same stress response the way physical stress does. And what stress does, it disrupts the brain architecture, but that this can be buffered by supportive relationships and the brain can recover. So it's often the capacity to regulate and manage depends on whether we feel connected to others and safe. And so I think the end message here is that there may and there is an impact of COVID. And the focus of this evening's talk is on relationships. And so bearing that in mind, that if we think about stress and response to COVID, to understand that good and healthy relationships, especially with their parents, are able to act as a protective buffer against stress and build resilience. So we're going to move now away from the outer world and more towards the teen world. So what is happening with your teenager? So please bear in mind that some of these things, like I said, are typical and may or may not apply to you. You can think about your own teen behavior and see how it's the same or different. But it's important when understanding teens is to meet them where they are. So I imagine parents might have expectations of what they want their teen to be or where they want them to be in life. Sometimes that differs from the teen's expectations. And sometimes that can result in kind of a miscuing where you're not able to meet each other because you're not understanding things from the same perspective. So when we talk about meeting them where they are, we also need to consider the developmental level. So this evening, I'm going to focus on emotional and social development and a little bit of brain development. But bearing in mind that I also want to acknowledge the physical development and the huge physical changes and significant changes that they're going through during this phase of their life and how that impacts them socially and emotionally. So while I don't focus on that, I'm saying that it is important and also needs to be considered. So just broad overview of what to expect from teenagers typically are mood swings and temper tantrums. These don't necessarily show up the same way they would have with your 2 or 3-year-old if you had that experience. Often there's less affection shown to parents, sibling rivalry, greatly influenced by their peers. They will sleep more. I'll talk to you a little bit later on about why that is. They're unorganized, extremely self-involved, self-conscious, rebellious, and conflictual. So these are things that may present itself with your teenager. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are there and that this is how your teenager is showing up. It's mostly to normalize the parents of teenagers who do exhibit these behavioral difficulties. So I'm going to look at developmental tasks over 2 periods of teenage years. The one is from 12 to 15, and then I'll look at 15 to 18. There is some overlap, but you'll notice that as your teen matures, there's almost a resolution of the things that they're struggling with towards the end. So in terms of resolution, I mean by, figuring out who they are in the world is actually the primary task of an adolescent. And that's about creating the identity based on the integration of values. And these values and the sense of self is often in relation to these systems I spoke about earlier. So it's society, other individuals, the opposite sex, culture and religion, the future, vocation, and ideas. All of these things are things that they are sitting with that can be very daunting for teens, but also very exciting. I think the daunting part of it comes in when they have to think about, their expectations and what they want for themselves and who they want to be, their parents' expectations, society's expectations, their teachers' expectations. So it can be a lot for them to manage, and it can be overwhelming. So what's happening in the brain then? So there are significant changes as the brain rewires itself through the teenage years. And these changes are important to bear in mind because it impacts behavior, emotions, and thinking. So what I want to encourage is an understanding that some of what your teen is presenting is not necessarily intentional, but a result of neurological changes happening in the brain. And actually, the capacity for learning and this remodeling during the teen years is never greater than during this time. So like newborns who have an exponential, growth with brain development, the teenage brain is still a work in progress, and it can impact them in different ways. What we need to think about and what we're focusing on, though, are social and emotional characteristics. And so I gave you an overview, but this is more specific to this age, bearing in mind that this isn't like a template of everything that can come up. So often during this period socially, the 12 to 15-year-old may withdraw from their parent, may show resistance to affection, feel parents are too restrictive, and feel the need to rebel. The suggested behavior for effective parenting during this time is not to take it personally. And this is difficult because often the way they present or how they talk to you or how they communicate must feel very personal. But we're going to talk a little bit later about activation and what that activates in you and how that guides your response. Another important thing is to choose your battle. So teenagers often feel very strongly about certain things, and sometimes there's a misalignment between the strength of what they're feeling and their conviction in it and parents' understanding of it. So it's important to choose your battles and think about, is this important enough for us to clash over, or can I let it go? Remember, please, that you are still important, but not in the same way that you were. So this has been developmental. So you had a little baby who needed you in a certain way, and they needed to be fed and clothed and comforted when they cried. And as they grew, they needed you to show up in different ways as a parent. And similarly with teenagers, what we need to do is be present, but be present differently because they need us differently. And what we need to talk about a little later is what that means then. Because just as your teenagers navigating these tumultuous years, so are you as a parent, especially, and even if you're not a first-time teenage parent, your teenagers are going to be very different in how they're navigating this stage of their life. So to understand that what this teen needs from you might not be the same to what their brother or sister needed from you when they were a teen or as a teen themselves. It's important that you respect their boundaries because they're going to create boundaries. They're going to push against boundaries, but also create it, but continue to be affectionate. One thing I'm going to touch on in much more detail later, because I think it's really important, is to set clear, firm, but flexible limits. And we will talk to what firm and flexible limits are. The other things they need is less family companionship and interaction than previously. And please understand that this is developmentally appropriate, that it is not, about them not needing you, as I said before, or not wanting to be with you, but they need to be with you and need you a little differently. So this is also something that parents sometimes take personally, but just to normalize it. They also might be annoyed by younger siblings. And so for effective parenting during this stage, what you need to allow them is the opportunities, safe opportunities for independent social activities, to be mindful of criticizing their friends because their peer group is really important at this stage, and to accept the teenager's feelings and help the younger siblings cope with rejection. So moving on, we're going to look at 15 to 19 years, and the developmental tasks here are pretty similar, if not actually exactly the same as it is for 12 to 15 years, in that it's still a development of personal identity, and it's still influenced by all these different systems and worlds that they're exposed to. But it's a little different here as they mature. I think especially with regards to brain development. So during the stage, as I've said earlier, which continues through 15 to 19, is that the brain is being rewired during adolescence. And this has a significant impact in how they behave, their emotions and their thinking, especially in terms of heightened response to incentives and slow impulse control. So if we think about why teens take unnecessary risks, and make poor decisions, it is partly, and I'm very mindful that they don't use this as an excuse, but it's partly due to the neurological changes or rewiring that's happening in the brain. There's also a flood of reproductive and stress hormones. There's a change in the way the brain regulates sleep, which affects attention, fatigue, and irritability. And often parents of teenagers will talk about how much their teen is sleeping, but so that you can understand that this is actually biological, their need for sleep. But it's not all doom and gloom. As they mature, they're better able to plan. This is once the rewiring has taken effect, bearing in mind that it doesn't stop once they reach early adulthood. It continues actually after that. And I think the brain is fully matured, if I'm not mistaken, at 25, but I'll go back and check that. So they're able to make better judgments. They're less impulsive. They have increased abstract reasoning, which is something they didn't have when they were younger. So they have a sense of who they are in relation to others. Eventually also, there's also a focus away from the self to the self in the world. So to continue with the 15 to 9-year-old emotional characteristics, they may appear moody, angry, lonely, impulsive, self-centered, confused, and or stubborn. Maybe some of this applies to you, maybe none of it does, but that's the normal, typical emotional characteristics. But there's also experience of conflict between dependence and independence. So in as much as they're excited about and yearning for independence, it can also be very scary. And I think what we need to understand as parents is helping them manage and navigate that, the push of and pull of wanting to be, but not wanting to be. So ways you can help with that is to accept their feelings and not overreact. Establish limits jointly with your teen, but not revert to childhood restrictions. So in terms of limits, think about what is developmentally appropriate. So what is developmentally appropriate for your 15-year-old isn't the same limit that you'd put for your 5-year-old. So avoid making fun of inconsistent behaviors and accept their need for separation. more social characteristics for 15 to 9-year-olds is that the relationships with their parents can range from friendly to hostile. Sometimes they might even feel that parents are too interested, and they usually have many friends and a few confidants. But this varies greatly according to level of maturity. They may also be strongly invested in a single romantic relationship. So this is typical for their age, and ways parents can manage this is to maintain a healthy relationship with their teenager, not to pry. So we're going to talk about, being interested in their lives, but not prying, and how to kind of navigate that, because it can be a little bit hard to know when you're prying and when you're showing interest for them. To recognize the current level of interest, and to avoid disapproval, discuss needs and expectations about relationships. So all families will have, what we're saying is that all families have their own ways of managing the family rules and boundaries, and it's important that you and your teen are able to communicate what's acceptable and what's not. So peers are a great influence during teenage years, and when they're moving away from their home, they're moving closer towards their peers as they're trying to find their identity. So just to bear in mind that peers are often not chosen randomly and aren't all bad. They actually tend to choose peers with similar values to their family, but they may even experiment with different peer groups, which is a normal part of the process as they're trying different identities and as they're trying and discovering who they are. So what's important here is who they associate with, because there can be healthy and unhealthy relationships. And it's important that parents are aware of their friendship groups, take an interest in the people that they are spending time with, the things that they are doing with these people that they are spending time with, and helping them navigate and understand the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships. These peers also have often more influence than parents on their interests and activities, because their focus here can be on fitting in or not wanting to conform to the norm. So often the peer groups are chosen in relation to their search for identity and who they think they are. We also cannot exclude the impact of social media and technology. So I think never before, previous generations have children and teens had been exposed to the world so far beyond, their national limits. So global world interaction and social media means that children are now exposed to different ways of life, different ways of being, different people, cultures, more so than ever before. And it's a recent study that I've come across. It says that parents play a major role in whether teens' use of digital technology is healthy or puts their mental and physical health at risk. So there are definite benefits to technology and social media, and I think it's important to not discount that. So there's a lot of talk recently, especially with teenagers, in the amount of screen time and the amount of, or the lack, of face-to-face time they're getting because they're preoccupied by the relationship with their cell phone. But just to say that there are benefits, there are pros and cons to this. They have access to information and education. During lockdown, especially when they were cut off from physical engagement and physical interaction with their peers, they were able to use technology and their phones and social media to have that kind of engagement and to maintain relationships. They're also able to form their identities through self-expression, learning and talking. They're exposed to a lot of different ways of being and so are able to, and I think that can be overwhelming, but then they're able to think through the options in their journey through adolescence. So what it also does, it promotes a sense of belonging and self-esteem through staying connected to friends. I said that earlier. What's important for parents to bear in mind is the risks. And the risks are quite great, and they need to be taken and monitored very seriously. So cyberbullying is from, primary school years through to high school years, and I'm talking specifically with children and teenagers, can have quite a detrimental effect on their well-being. It can have quite a detrimental effect on their mental health. So I would encourage parents to have conversations and monitor the groups, if it is via WhatsApp groups that they belong to, social media groups, Instagram, because it's when they're opening themselves up to this world, they're also opening up the option and the possibility of feedback. And sometimes this feedback happens through trolling, where people deliberately starting arguments to upset people on the internet and causing distress. But also the risk of the phone is isolation. It can feel safer to engage with people and less daunting and overwhelming, especially after spending 2 years or so in lockdown, to have face-to-face time. And so what it can potentially do is create barriers to social engagement once children are, and which most of them are now, fully face-to-face. Then also concerningly, there are too easy access to inappropriate materials and inappropriate relationships. So it's very important that parents manage and check up on the material and the relationships that your teen is engaging in on social media. So we're talking, there was talk about, what is a realistic screen time, and that's changed a lot. So in the past it was 2 hours, but it's currently being revised because there's an understanding that this isn't realistic. Although it is important to set limits for recreational screen time. So not all screen time is recreational, which is why it's more than 2 hours has been suggested. So children and teenagers especially are often using it to access different information for school projects, information for learning and education. So you need to consider, is this educational screen time or is this recreational screen time, and distinguish between the two. You also need to see where they're looking for information, what's the quality of this information, and do they know what good quality is? And I think especially the younger teen needs to be monitored quite closely so that they can understand, as they navigate this social world, this huge social world, what is appropriate and what isn't, what is good quality and what isn't. You need to kind of keep track of what games and apps they're using, whether they're using screen time for distraction or procrastination, and also to remember that it's all about balance. So screen time is okay, but it's also important that they do get face-to-face time, that there is physical exercise, and there are screen-free times. So in some families, that's over meal times. In some families, it's 1 day a week. And how you and your family choose to navigate that is up to you, but also to bear in mind that children, often teenagers, watch their parents. And so if you are spending 50% of your home time on the screen, they are looking to you as a model. Sorry. So what's important to bear in mind here is when it moves away from being balanced to unbalanced and unhealthy. And so teenagers have been showing up with screen addiction and obsessive tech-related behavior. Often also there's not enough sleep. There's a name for it, although it's still unofficial, and it's called nomophobia, which is no mobile phone phobia. And I think parents as well as teens could potentially have nomophobia. So parents need to educate themselves on how technology works, because they might not be aware of how addictive it can be. They need to manage appropriate control to check and limit screen time, and educate teens about the effects of social media on their health. So moving on to your relationship with your teen and how to maintain your relationship. So it might be that you already have a good enough relationship and you're attending the store to find ways of strengthening it, or just for more information around it. Or it might be that you're actually having a very challenging time with your teen. And what this talk essentially is about this evening is it's about that relationship. I said right at the beginning, for those who joined more recently, that a child's relationship with their family and with their parent or primary caregiver is an essential and significant protective buffer to emotional and mental health and social development. And it starts off when they're little. So what this diagram illustrates is what their needs are when they're young. And the reason this is important is because what gets set up in the first 5 years of life, and this is according to attachment theory, what gets set up forms the template of how they engage with the world, how they understand themselves, and how they understand others. So what parents provided to the younger child and what they were able to give them, it's something that a child holds in memory and and it kind of comes their way of relating, and they take it into their teenage years. So initially what parents are meant to be is a secure base and a safe haven. And I said to you before that your teen needs you, they just need you differently, but they still need you to be that secure base and the safe haven. And if they've had that experience of you being there for them in that way, that will help them navigate these years. So it's often children or teenagers that haven't had this experience that may struggle more than others. So they need you to do what you did for them then, just differently. They need you to encourage their exploration, to celebrate their achievements, but also they need to know that you're there if they need you. And it might not be the 3-year-old that runs to you crying. It might show up differently. It might just be that their knowledge of you being there when they're going through tough times, even if they're not able to communicate that to you, is enough. So the safe haven is really important because it's a buffer against stress and uncertainty, especially the stress and uncertainty that they have to navigate in adolescence. Important here is that proximity is a natural antidote for anxiety and vulnerability. And what that means is having an available, consistent, present parent can help them manage anxiety and their vulnerability. The secure base also makes it possible for them to explore the world. So in teenage years, it's all about exploration and curiosity. Who am I? Who am I becoming? Who are these people around me? Do I like them? Don't I like them? Do I fit in and don't I fit in? And it's having the secure base that was set up in their early years that allows them the freedom to do that. Not having that might cause some anxiety or difficulty in navigating different spaces in the world. But what this also does is it helps them learn to reach out for support and offer support to others because they've had that experience. So when we think about our maintaining a relationship with our teen, it's important that we create a reflective space. I know that a few weeks ago that there was a seminar or a talk on conscious parenting. So for those of you who weren't part of that, I encourage you to go back and have a look at it because it's very important that we think about the kind of parents we are and what kind of parents we need to be for our teens. So it might be that you're the kind of parent right now that your teen needs exactly, but it also might mean that there are certain ways of parenting that have raised challenges in your relationship with your teen that you have to renegotiate with yourself. So there are 4 different types of parenting. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm mindful of time. But essentially, there's the unengaged parent. And so with this parent, there's an inconsistent presence in the child's life. So essentially, these are the teens who are raising themselves because there isn't a parental figure to set boundaries and monitor what they're doing. The dominating parent, who's often hard and rigid. With these parents, there's very low nurturance and high expectations, but also low respect. There's the permissive parent, where there's inconsistent enforcement of rules or no rules at all. And this is the parent who wants to be more of a friend than a parent. And so parenting type or style that has been looked at more positively is positive parenting. And I'll tell you in a little bit why that is. So positive parenting involves warm, supportive, and encouraging relationships or parenting style while being firm, consistent, and clear with limits and boundaries. This kind of parenting also encourages independence. And you'll notice here that with positive parenting, there's high nurturance, high expectations, but also high respect. So this is the kind of parenting that is most likely to have positive impact on your child development. So with positive parenting, and this has been shown by research, these teenagers do better at school. They have lower rates of depression and stress. They are less likely to engage in risky behavior. They have better social skills, are more respectful, and manage conflict better. What's very important with positive parenting and what makes it differ from permissive parenting is that the parent and the child understands that the parent is not a friend. The teen is going to have friends, but it's important that the parent understands that their role is very different but very necessary. And part of their role is about setting rules and boundaries. And this is essential for teens because in a world that is so broad and so overwhelming, what rules and boundaries do is offers containment. It's saying to them, these are the limits. So the world is there, you can negotiate, you can explore, but these are the limits. And limits are important in a world that is seemingly limitless. So there are firm rules, and you and your family will decide, and your teen will decide what is the firm rules. And the firm rules are the ones that are hard-nosed, that are non-negotiable, whether they agree with it or not. I think especially if we consider what is seen socially and on social media as normal and what in Muslim families we expect from our teens might be very different. It's important to locate it within, religion and culture and what is expected of them within your family. So they are hard-nosed and they are non-negotiables, and it's important that the teen understands that they don't need to agree with this or not. But it's also important to recognize that there are some rules that are flexible and open to negotiation and discussion. And these can also be rules that are ever changing. So what might have been appropriate for your 10-year-old might be a rule that falls away for your 15-year-old. And so you negotiate that through discussion. And what's important with positive parenting is that the teen themselves are part of these discussions. What this means is that they get a say and they get to share their opinions and thoughts about these rules and boundaries. And it's often when you create a space of sharing and allowing them to share their voice that they might be more or less resistant to change and less resistant to rules and boundaries. So teens appreciate being part of the conversation and the recognition that their voice is important in their family. And this is important because what the teen is doing is navigating and sharing their voice in a way that they're eventually going to take out into society. They're going to take it to their schools, they're going to take it to their workplace when they get older, because they're going to recognize that what they say matters, that their voice is important, and then that they matter. So essentially, when connecting with your teen, what they're wanting to know, that's not always as so explicit, is, are you there for me? And there's an acronym with this. So they need to know that parents are accessible. Can I reach you when I need you? That they are responsive. Do I matter to you? Will you come when I call? Can I risk leaning on you? Can I depend on you? And engagement, which is, can I share my emotions with you? Will you keep me close? And it's often that early, the circle of security that we spoke about at the beginning, that is set up when they're quite young. It's actually there where it starts, where they get a sense that my parent is reliable. My parent will be there when I need for them because my parent is my secure base. With all of this, though, what's essential in maintaining a connection with your teen or reconnecting with your teen is to create a space for open communication. So the world they live in and what they're exposed to may be different to the world as you understand it. And so create a space that they can share what their world is like for them. Sometimes it can be in a non-threatening space. So teens might not want to have face-to-face conversation, but would prefer to talk while walking or cooking or in a car drive because it feels less threatening and kind of confrontational. So they can share their thoughts without, seeing what your expression is, because they might be cautious and have a sense of what you imagine that you, or how they imagine you'd respond to certain things. So anyway, non-threatening space is perfect. You're riding in the car, you're talking about their day, their life, what's important to them, what their world is like. It's important to be attentive, present, available, and curious. So what was that like for you? And the reason why this way of being is important is because if your teen imagines that they're going to be judged or that they're going to be criticized, they are going to be less likely to talk to you openly. So maintaining curiosity is always very important because it shows them that you're interested in their life. Seek to understand, and if understanding is not possible, show interest. So we can't always understand what's important to them. It might not be important to us, but for your teen, the things that aren't important to you might be everything. So it's important that we don't invalidate their feelings and experience. Again, if we do, they are less likely to come to you and share feelings and experience because they feel like you're not taking them seriously. So for your, normal self-absorbed teen, a new pair of shoes or a TV show might be very important and everything. And as an adult, you understand that actually in the bigger scheme of things, it isn't. So the teen doesn't always need to hear that if it matters to them, that we need to be interested in it and acknowledge that it matters, even if it's not, even if we don't share their feelings about this. It's also important to understand that communication does not always have to be verbal. There are different ways of communicating. You can see your teen walking in from a long day at school. It's late in the afternoon. They've had sports. They looked exhausted. And you can say, oh, you look so tired. I think you need to go and rest. What you're communicating to them is that I see you. And I'm giving you a suggestion of what you need because I'm noticing that you're tired. What's also important is to create space and make time for fun, laughter, and shared interests, and enjoy your teenager. This is a very challenging period of development for children and parents. And it feels like a lot of what I've been saying has been a bit doom and gloom, but to also understand that this is a very exciting period of life for them and for you, that they're sharing with your world that's unfamiliar to you. And there's actually so much from them that we can learn if we listen. It's important to spend quality time together. So for me, it's not so much quantity as quality, and that when you're present with your teen and doing something together, you're fully present. You're not on your phone, you're not distracted, you're not having a conversation with someone else, but that you're present and that you're there and that you're attending to them. So whatever that might mean, if it's 20 minutes in the car drive home, that they have all your attention. That's okay. They know that you're interested in them and you're available to them. So to engage and involve them in your life and your thinking and family decisions, to respect their choices within reason again, to share interests where you can. If you don't have that specific interest, to be interested in their interest. So if it is that they on playing games on their PlayStation and you're not interested in playing with them, you can ask them about it. So what is it you're doing? Who are you talking to? Because they often engage with their peers. What's happening for you? What's going on? And so share their interests in whichever place, manner, or form it is, because that's the way of kind of holding on to a connection. It's important to encourage independence, but also to let them learn from their mistakes. And this can sometimes be very difficult. It's difficult to watch someone fall when you could have done something to pick them up. But it's an important life lesson and developmental lesson for teens. So if you imagine your infant growing up, crawling and then starting to walk, what you needed to do was let them navigate walking on their own. Sometimes it meant that they fell and sometimes you were there to catch them. But the times that you weren't there to catch them, and I hope it wasn't too serious, the fall, what they learned is to pick themselves up and then start walking again. And so that's essentially what your teen is needing to learn by making mistakes. They need to learn how to manage the feelings that it brings up for them. And they need to learn how to pick themselves up. And if you don't allow them the opportunity to learn that for themselves and develop that skill for themselves, it's often these teenagers that might struggle into adulthood to manage difficulty. So see them for who they are, treat them as individuals. So what's in a family of different children, it's important to recognize that each child is unique. And so comparisons can often be detrimental to teens. Can't you be more like? That kind of robs them of their individuality and sets them up for always having to meet the standards maybe of another sibling, of a parent, of an aunt, or whatever it might be. And something that I feel doesn't happen enough, and I'm not sure why that is praise. So it's very important to praise your teen, because what it does is it will boost their self-esteem. But teens are very perceptive. It cannot be false, empty praise. So praise on specific things. So acknowledge the things that they have done well, what they're good at, what they're trying to improve. And say, I noticed that you did better this month in math than you did last month. I'm proud of you for working so hard. And the reason this is because the world can be critical enough. It's our job as parents to be their biggest cheerleaders, fans, safety nets, and their calm in the storm. They're going to go out into the world where they're not always going to get what they want, where they're not always going to be chosen for a team in sports or a certain class or a certain group. And we need to be there as their secure base to catch them when they fall. Respect their growing independence and individuality, because all of this helps them navigate to be better functioning adults and prepares them for the world. So what you're essentially doing with your teen is by allowing them to have certain experiences, by giving them boundaries and rules, you are preparing them for an adult world. So just a quick overview of the basic principles of good parenting is what you do matters. You cannot be too loving, be involved in your child's life, adapt your parenting to fit your child, establish rules and limits, foster independence, be consistent, avoid harsh discipline, explain your rules and decisions, and treat your child with respect. So sometimes in relationships, and that's not only parent and child relationship, but all relationships, there can be ruptures. And when we're talking about reparation and healing now, this can be a section that's of interest to you because there's a specific event that happened with you and your child that you're struggling to navigate and work through. Or it can be that actually your relationship with your teen is not what you want it to be. And you want to build a stronger and healthier relationship with them. And begin to look at ways of doing this with the understanding that it's often when your teen is at their most challenging that they need you the most. So I've spoken a little about attachment, I think earlier, but just to talk more specifically about attachment theory here, and I've mentioned it in the circle of security, that the primary human need is for connection, and that actually this is hardwired in our brains, especially in the first 5 years. So essentially what I mentioned earlier is that in the first 5 years, we develop a template of how we think about ourselves and how we relate to others. If there were difficulties during that period, they can show itself with your teens, and it shows itself through struggling to make bonds with others, having control issues, anger issues, underdeveloped conscience, and aversion to physical touch. And so we can't go back in time. We cannot go back and change the first 5 years. What we can do, though, is make reparation in the here and now, because remember, their brain is still rewiring itself. So there's a potential to make repair during this period. And I think it's especially important if we consider teenagers who have difficult attachment problems and how that shows up in adulthood. So often with mental health problems in adults, the onset is around 14 years of age, which is why this is a critical period where we can make reparation and help them and guide them to develop more healthier ways of being. So there's secure attachment, which is similar to positive parenting that we spoke about earlier, and then there's insecure attachment. What this means, though, is that your teen will show up presenting with secondary emotions, and these have a protective factor. And the reason they do that is to hide their feelings of vulnerability or hurt or shame. And I'll talk a little bit about what secondary emotions is in a minute. But on the other side, you might have teens that amplify their emotions. They amplify their fear, their anger, and their sadness. And that's often to engage a non-responsive parent. So my parent doesn't pay attention to me. It's only when I throw things around and break them that I get their attention. So that's what I'm going to need to do to get it. So when we talk about secondary emotions are forming a protective factor, what they're protecting against are primary emotions. And those are often anger, sadness, anxiety. And the reason that the teen doesn't show up with these is because they're underneath all of that is fear, and underneath all of that can be shame and hurt. But what happens in this respect then is that the parents are responding to the secondary emotion, which is the anger. And because of that, there's a miscuing. And so there's this almost like this cycle happening. So child presents with anger, but actually they're really sad. Anger is just, easier for them to display. Parents react to their anger, which disengages parents. And then, it's not healthy for the teen or the parent, because it creates hostility and it creates kind of dysregulated emotions for both of them. But what we're going to look at in a little while, and I'm very mindful that we're so close to time, I'll try and go as quickly as I can, is what we do when to kind of relate better to primary emotions. So sadness also can be depressed mood and withdrawal, but may be misinterpreted by parents as lack of interest in the relationship. So what happens when you're out of sync with your child? So in normal relationships, it's usual to have ruptures, but what's most important is to repair them. And this is often related to mistuned emotional connection. So this is an example we're talking about earlier. So your teen comes home from school and they're really angry. They fight with their sibling. They ignore, argue with the parent. And what the parent does is respond to the behavior, not the cause, because we don't know what the cause are. And unless the teen communicates with us, all we can see is behavior. It's important then that you find out context, especially if this is a typical or normal behavior for your teen. What this is signaling to you that something happened today, something went wrong, they are feeling sad or upset. I need to find out what that is. But this doesn't discount the fact that this behavior was unacceptable. So we have to separate, unacceptable behavior, but creating space to find out the cause, because what we help them do then is discuss better ways of managing challenges. So I understand you had a difficult day, you weren't chosen for the soccer team, but it's not okay to come home and fight with your sibling. It's not okay to come home and argue with me. What can you do differently in the future? For repair to happen, the parent needs to be an attentive presence, because there's a healing power in sharing your emotional experience with another. It's important that the parent who is present is authentic and attentive. And over time, what this can create is a correctional relational experience. But to repair, you need to be consistent, Because if it is that you've had an unhealthy relationship with your teen and you want it to be different, it's important that you communicate it to them. They won't understand what's happening. It might have been something you thought about doing, but it's actually really important that you say to them, you know, I'm thinking that this isn't, we need to have a different relationship with each other, and I want to work on it, making it different. Your teen might not trust you to be consistent because maybe in the past they've seen that there wasn't consistency. And so what you need to do is be really patient with yourself and with them and be consistent until they believe that this is the new way of being in your family. So initially you can expect some skepticism from your team because they're just not familiar with you being this way. So resolving issues takes time. And since, especially because it takes time to rewire the brain. So like I said, patience, it's really important. You need to respond to your teen's cries as consistently as possible. When I say cries, it means what does your teen do to look for attention? Or so when I say look for attention, I mean like what are the ways they're needing you that they're not communicating to you? So they come home and they kick the dog. And actually what they're saying to you is, I'm in distress and I need attention. And our job as parents is to look out for these signs and then engage with them in the way. It's not okay to kick the dog, but something's not okay with you. Can we talk about this and can we find different ways of you managing your feelings? And so it's important here also, especially if you spent the last 12, 13 years being a certain kind of parent and you want to change some of your parenting style, to be patient with yourself. There's a psychologist, a theorist that I really like, and I talk about him quite often when I teach, and his name is Winnicott. And what Winnicott says is that we do not need to be perfect parents. We only need to be good enough. And it means something very specific to him. But when I learned this, I felt that it was very liberating. I also think something like perfection is not what we want our children or ourselves to aspire to, because it's not achievable. But also perfect means different things to different people. So when you give yourself permission to be good enough, you're also giving your teen permission to be good enough, that it's okay to make mistakes, that sometimes we do make bad choices. But what we can do is learn from them. What's most important if you're repairing is to be consistent, even if you feel like there's nothing showing for it. So you're consistently making yourself available to your teen, but they're not taking you up on the offer. They don't trust that space yet. So what you need to do is just be consistent and persistent and make sure that they know that the space is available to them, whether they need it or not. It's going to be very important during this time that you don't let them down. If they've had an experience of you letting them down in the past, what they will think is, oh, nothing has changed, it's still the same. But we are human and we make mistakes, and that might happen. What is different this time, though, is that you can maybe have a conversation with them about that experience. I can tell I really let you down. I'm so sorry I let myself down also. And it's okay to be honest and share that with your teen, because what it means is that they'll then role model that and be honest and with sharing with you. So eventually, with consistency and persistency, teen will get a sense of security and they'll let their guard down. So other ways of repairing is by setting boundaries. And I think we've spoken about this enough. Make your teen feel love and to give them the attachment experiences they missed in childhood. It might be hugs. It might just be being physically present. It might be being attuned and your kind of undivided attention. Teach them how to identify and accept emotions and not label emotions as good or bad. Teach them better ways of managing emotions. Undivided time and attention, like I said, is in ways that your teen is okay with. So what you think is undivided time and attention might be something different to them. They might not want to be sitting in a coffee shop with you for 2 hours and, made to feel like they have to talk. Find out from your teen, what they'd like you to do with them, but that you're interested in being a part of their life. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it and make amends. That's very important. And always be available to reconnect with them after conflict. So communication is key. But if after you've tried all of this and you feel like you've been consistently present, and this has been for enough of a time that you'd imagine that your relationship would be different, what is important is also for you to recognize that professional help for repairing your relationship with your teen, especially if your teen is showing up with difficult behaviors that is causing functional problems at school or with their peers, it's important that you access professional help and that you are able to acknowledge the limitations of what you're able to do. And perhaps the rupture, which is ideally, first line of defense when ruptures occurs and trauma and stress occurs, is the parental system. But if the parental system is not able to make enough change and to create a more healthier way of being, that professional help should be something that you consider either for your teen or for yourself or for both of you. And we're talking about dysregulation now and unhealthy ways of relating and managing feelings. And so how do we manage it better? And what your teen needs from you is to help them with that. So just as your baby that was crying was because they were hungry, needed to be picked up and calmed down, your teen needs the same thing from you. Just obviously in a different way. And so you need to think about what it means for them, because what that creates is a containing safe space, what it means for them at this age to have that space and what they need from you. So when your teens are hyperactivated emotionally, what happens is that their thinking brain or ability kind of shuts down and they go into survival mode, where it's about fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm sure many of you have heard that term before. So hyper-aroused teens may be defined, resistant, upset, or aggressive. And if you think about your 2 or 3-year-old, if you've had that experience yourself, or you've seen it in the shops, having a temper tantrum, how hard it is to engage with them or how hard it is to get them out of it. It's a little bit similar with your teen that and I imagine with you, if you've had that experience, when you are so upset or angry or overwhelmed, it is hard to find a space for reasoning. So essentially, when your teen is in this state, they cannot be reasoned with, and you cannot expect to have a meaningful, productive conversation with them. So your first job as a parent is to reduce their arousal levels. But it won't help if you yourself have been activated. So we get activated by our children. They can say really mean things to us, for example. They can say things that weren't allowed when we were children. That can activate it. And if you feel yourself getting activated, what's really important is that you step away, find your calm before you go back. Because what you don't want is to increase the activation, emotional energy and charge in the room even more. Your job as a parent is to help your teenager manage that calm. And if you don't have that to offer them, then you need to find it and then come back. Because you're not able to engage in conversations when you're like in this state, and the outcomes are also better if you do not get activated. So co-regulation comes before self-regulation. So essentially, when we have babies and we spend a lot of time with them, we consistently soothe them, what they eventually learn to do as they get older is soothe themselves. So they're able to tolerate more time away from the parent because they know, 500 times before that, my mom has always, or my dad, whoever it is, has always shown up. I know that they eventually will. And so as babies get older, they're able to tolerate more and more time away from their parents because they eventually develop an internal capacity to soothe themselves. And so what they needed, though, was the parent doing that for them first. What happens during the teenage years is that emotions and hormones and everything, the world around them and navigating it can be so overwhelming that they struggle to self-regulate, which is when they need the parent. So the parent is the one that lends them the calm when they're overwhelmed. And if your teen hasn't had the experience of self-soothe, being able to soothe or calm themselves in the past, they're not going to be able to calm themselves if you send them to their room. So often a dysregulated teen, I can't talk to you, please go to your room. They have no prior experience to draw from. So they're going to need you to lend them your experience and help them manage it so that they're able to do this for themselves. Because an adolescent might not know how to self-regulate. What's most important here, though, and I've said this before, is that you yourself are not activated or triggered by your teen, because this will show up with them if you don't work it through. So I'm hoping that in the conscious parenting talk, you became more aware, for those of you who did attend, on what activates you, and so how you can be a more mindful, reflective, and conscious parent is going to be very important with your teen. So what we need to do is then develop an understanding of the emotional world, but also help them understand it. And what helps with this, and I'm very mindful that this is even happening with me as I'm talking to it now, is to slow the pace of thinking and talking. So essentially, I'm going to show you a thermometer. It's just something really practical that I use with younger children that can also be helpful with teens. What your job is to lower the temperature on the thermometer and to identify primary feelings. And I'm going to show you the anger iceberg so that you have a sense of what that might be. To also understand our feelings in relation to context, and even if you can't understand it, to empathize. So I'm really upset because 3 of my friends went off to the mall and they didn't invite me. You as a parent might think that's not a big deal, but for your teen, that might be a very big deal that can be very upsetting. So even if you can't understand the context, it's important that you empathize. That must have been so hard. That must have been so hard for you. You probably felt excluded. Attend also to the storyteller and not just the story. So they'll tell you about the background. It's important that you as a parent tune into what they're presenting to you. And so then not only verbally are you sharing with them an understanding of empathy, but you're also mirroring it to them bodily. So, through responsiveness and attunement. So they need you to sit and be present and there, and sometimes eye contact, yes, and sometimes eye contact, no, depending on the teen and what they're comfortable with, is what they need from you in that moment to help them bring their own temperature down. Also to have conversations about what it is they need, because what you think they might need might not be at all what they need. So they'll come home from school upset because something happened and you want to talk about it. It might not be what they need. Actually, what they might need is space or time or a hug. So it's important that you have conversations around, when you're feeling like this, I'm not sure what to do. What would you like from me? How can I support you? And they can say to you, well, can you just leave me alone for a little while and I'll come back to you when I'm ready. And it's through these conversations and this engagement that we're able to maintain our connection, but also the reparation that you want to make because you were misattuned or misaligned with your teen, you are able to make through using these ways of being with them from a point of understanding. If they're not sure what they need, you can have a discussion and you as an adult can come up with options. So I'm not sure what I need when I feel really upset and I don't know what to do. And you can have a discussion in your family. What do you do, mom? What do you do, sister or auntie or Oma? What do you do when you're feeling like this? And so you can find ways that will be helpful for them. Sometimes it helps to change the scenery, do something active, and then come back when you're both calm and able to talk. So I'm aware that we're a little bit over. I'm almost done. I'm going to quickly go through emotions. And so when we spoke about primary and secondary emotions earlier, the anger iceberg reflects the part of the iceberg you can see, but actually underneath there's a whole lot of other things going on. And so what you're seeing is the secondary emotion. You're seeing the anger, the frustration, the irritation, but what that's actually doing, it's guarding against emotions that maybe are experienced more frighteningly, emotions that are experienced in a way that brings shame or fear. And so it's important that you and your teen are able to talk about what is happening here and that you're able to understand it with them. So you're showing up really angry, what happened? And it could be something that happened that caused them feelings of shame. But this feelings of shame is something that's uncomfortable for them to sit with, so it's showing itself as anger. What's important for you and your team to identify is that what's going on behind the anger. So what is the secondary emotion covering up, and what has happened for you? So that's the first important step. The next important step is, so now you know what you're feeling and you understand what it's about. What do you do with it? And I just want to say that some feelings, I consider feelings not to be good or bad, but comfortable and uncomfortable. So there are some feelings that are easier to tolerate than others. So, joy and happiness are generally feelings people are more comfortable with, peace and calm, but it's anger, frustration, fear, shame that people might struggle with, or anxiety. And so it's important that we help normalize these feelings for our team, and we can normalize it by sharing our own feelings. You can decide on how much detail you want to go into, but it's okay to say to your team, I feel anxious, I feel afraid sometimes. And then you can have a conversation. What do you do when you're anxious and afraid? And I'm thinking now just about very recently, I was feeling really stressed out and anxious. I can't remember why it was. And my teenage daughter said to me, and I said to them, I'm just feeling really stressed out and anxious, whatever has happened. My teenage daughter very casually looks at me and says, but why don't you do what you tell us to do when we're anxious? And I couldn't help but laugh, because I was so activated, I wasn't able, and I wasn't, the things I talk about, I wasn't accessing my thinking brain and thinking, how do I manage these feelings? And so she needed to tell me what to do, which was very useful to know that it's constantly, a learning process, and that I need to also make use of and practice what I teach, which what teens are very good at sharing with you when you don't do that. But it was just a really funny experience to me. And she said, but you're anxious and you tell us how to do things. Why aren't you doing it yourself? And so that's a good lesson for us as parents, to the things that we expect from our teens. In some respect, we need to model and show them. And one of it could be managing your feelings. So if you're able to manage your feelings, your teen can see that, they can learn from you, and then use what you do to manage your own feelings. So there are some very practical ways of doing this. If you're not able to get in the car and drive off or go for a walk, or you can't go and kick a ball around, whatever it is, there are things that you can help your teen to bring them back. And these are called grounding exercises. And essentially what they're doing is they bring your teen back into the room and into this moment. So they're not in the state of overwhelm. And there are two very simple and user-friendly techniques that I use a lot, especially in therapy, both with children and with teens. And the one is the thermometer. I use it with my own children also. And the other one is the SOS grounding technique. So the thermometer essentially is giving your teen a way of communicating the extent of their feelings, or how dysregulated they are. So you'd say, and so you can have a visual for this if you need it. I use a visual for younger children often, and it's as simple as, on a scale of 0 to 10, how upset are you? So often you want to give them an occasion or an experience of them being very upset that they can equate with being a 10, because otherwise, I didn't get chosen for the soccer team, it's a 10. I lost my sock, it's a 10. So it's not. So you need to say, what is the most upset you've been ever in your life where you felt very out of control? And they'll say, it was when this and that happened. Okay. So that's the bar for the worst you've ever felt, when things were like really hard and you were really struggling. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, then we get the middle ground. That's when you were feeling okay. It wasn't the best. And maybe 0 was where everything was just chill and you were feeling totally fine. So your teen comes home and they're like, I'm really upset. I had a really bad day. What you can do is say to them, oh, what happened? or on a scale of 1 to 10, how upset are you? And they could say that they're at a 6, and you can say, okay, 6 isn't bad. You've been at 10 before. So how do we manage to bring the temperature on the thermometer down? And what's ideal here is that you, at a 10, you can't stop it. At a 10, it almost kind of has a life of its own. So if your teen is able to monitor their feeling state in relation to this thermometer, they are able, and you are able, to better manage it and bring it down. So it's easier to bring it down from a 5 or a 4 or 6 than it might be from a 9 or a 10. Because remember, when we're at a 9 and 10, the level of arousal is so great that we're not able to use our cognitive ability. So, they had, and you can use it every day, very casually, just to check in with them. Oh, how was your day? Oh, no, it was really good, in terms of how happy you're feeling on a scale of 0 to 10. So it doesn't always have to be for like negative experiences or overwhelming or uncomfortable emotions. How happy are you? I'm at a 5. Okay, 5's okay. When were you happiest? When were you not happy? How sad are you? The saddest I've ever been was when my pet passed away, and that was a 10. How sad are you today? Oh no, today I'm maybe at a 4. So it gives you a sense of where they are on the continuum and how you need to intervene. And it gives them a sense of, being able to describe and the severity of a feeling in relation to an event. And so they might say to you, I can't find my favorite shoes. I'm at a 10. And what's useful is that you can say to them, well, when you're at a 10 last time, this is what happened. Do you think that and not finding your favorite shoes is at the same? And they'd be like, no, it isn't at the same level. Maybe I'm not a 10. And so that's another way that you can almost talk them down. Another grounding exercise is the SOS, and you can talk them through this. You can also use this as parents yourself, where it's about slowing down, sitting back, taking a deep breath, paying attention to your breathing, orientating yourself to where you are right now and what you're doing, and then doing a self-check. So on a scale of what you're feeling, and a scale of 1 to 10, sorry, that's error there, how stressed out and in control are you feeling? So parents can also do this when they're activated. So when they notice that what their child's coming with is activating for them, they can step away and do like SOS for themselves. You can do it with your child so that you can both deactivate together. Another thing to do, which is a mindfulness-based exercise, I'll go through really quickly, is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can do it with little children, older children, adults. What it does is it helps bring that temperature on the thermometer down by bringing them physically present into the room. So 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you can taste or enjoy eating. And you'll often find with this, if they started off at an 8 and you go through all these steps, not as fast as I've done, but much more slowly, that they're going to be able to say to you, okay, well, I was an 8 before this, I'm now a 7. And that's okay, because all we need to do is slowly bring the temperature down so that you're able to have the conversation. So this is the end. I went over time. I must apologize for that. But just to say that takeaway is that we're all in the same boat, but rowing different boats. Sorry, all in the same ocean, but rowing different boats. And this evening was about strengthening the tools or your boat itself so that you're able to navigate these uncharted territories easier. I also want to share resources that I've recently come across, and I found it's really good. It is written for teens and it's very user-friendly. It's by a local psychiatrist that works with children and teens in the Western Cape. That's now in private practice, and I think you can find it online. She doesn't know I'm sharing this. I came across it myself and I read up on it, and I thought it would be really good for parents to share with their teens. So Shukran, are there any questions?
You'll find the questions in the Q&A box, so I can either read them out to you or you can go through them yourself. Which would you prefer?
I'll go through them myself.
Okay, great.
I just want to say, though, that I'm mindful that I'm seeing your questions and what you share with me without the context of it. And so I'll respond to it in that respect. But if I missed anything, please let me know. So the first question is, how do you deal with grandparents, friends imposing their expectations on your teen? So I think that's very real and something that parents are struggling with. That when the expectations are not even only your own, but that these expectations are coming from external sources. What's most important is their relationship with you and your expectations of them, and that you create a space where you say to them, it's okay for you to be what you want to be. And actually what you need to do is be the protective buffer against these outside expectations that potentially can add pressure to your teen, which is not ideal. So parents, that's your job. You're the guardian there, and you guard them against these expectations, but also that you help your teen kind of find themselves, find out what they need. And you need to talk about why, if it is with peers, they feel the need to meet someone else's expectations. I hope that answered your question. The next question is, how does one monitor social media without praying? Trying, I imagine. So you can't monitor. What I do with my teens is I sit on their social media. Well, they're not really allowed to be on social media yet. They have a joint account with mine. But in any case, I try and monitor conversations. I try and monitor. It's really difficult because it's almost like policing them and not allowing them privacy. But I think the potential harm it could do not to kind of outweighs that. And so then we have a conversation that it's not that I don't trust you, but just the world out there can be very scary, and you might not even know that this is what's going on. And so then I sit next to my teen and I say, let's see what you've been looking at. Let's go through your history. But teens are very clever also. And I think the older they get and more technologically savvy they get, they're able to find ways of doing things. I think open communication is the key here. To say, it's my responsibility as your parent to monitor what you're on, because you might not always know that it's not okay. And that can be a firm rule. It doesn't have to be a flexible rule. So how can you guide your child towards choosing the correct influences on social media? Those who espouse your own values, we might get into arguments about it because parents don't understand what is cool and fashion. Well, that's a tough one, because I said social media is normalizing a certain way of being or dressing or being in the world that might not align itself to your family values. And I think it's important to bring them back to that this is what's happening out there, and they're going to be people that live differently or make different choices and are allowed to do that. But as Muslim children living in this home, these are our roots. So you can admire it, but you don't have to copy it. So it's important that they understand that the influences they choose are people who they can admire. You're not saying that they can't admire them, but you are saying this is how they're different to what we believe in. And this is a non-negotiable. It's okay to say that. If you find that the people they're engaging with are inappropriate, then you tell them to disengage. That's inappropriate behavior, that's not how I want you to live. And then I don't think you should follow them anymore. And it's okay to have these conversations, because what you're doing then is providing them with boundaries for social media that I think is very new to parents now. We haven't needed to do that generations past, but you're saying these are okay, these are like okay people to follow, and these aren't. And it's going to be difficult. You aren't always going to able to manage and navigate that. But you need to trust that you've given yourself, that you've given your child, a basis and a rooting in Islamic, fundamentals that will ground them and keep them from engaging in ways of being in the world that goes against that. So, that's our hope. But it's not always how things happen. I understand the reality of it. So screen time limits. So it used to be 2 hours, but like I say, the research currently is saying that 2 hours is not realistic, and that we need to consider what screen time is recreational and what is for learning. And so you decide in your family that maybe 2 hours recreational screen time is okay, and that, 2 hours learning screen time or more, but you'd need to monitor that. My teen struggles to express feelings. How do we know when this difficulty is just them figuring themselves out, or when we should step in? That's a really good question. So you can help them. So if they're struggling to express their feelings, you help them identify feelings, and you can use the anger iceberg. You can say, what are you feeling now? I can't tell what you're feeling. And when I can't tell what you're feeling, I'm not sure what you need from me. So find ways that can help them express their feelings in ways that don't make them feel too vulnerable. So often what helps with that is expressing easier feelings. So when you're happy, you're laughing and you're joyful, and I know how you're feeling, and it's so good to know how you're feeling. But I don't always know when you're sad, because I can't see it. So how do I know when you're sad? Because maybe their way of expressing their sadness is different to what you understand, and then there's a miscuing. So they'll say, when I'm sad, I'm just quiet and sitting down, and that's how they deal with it. Think about the expression of feelings, and if it's your expectation that if someone is sad, they need to cry, but actually for your teen, if they're sad, that crying is not necessarily how they express that. So think about it also in relation to expectation. How do you deal with the child who keeps pushing the boundaries for a hard no and non-negotiable? So before we agree to a rule, you're allowed to visit a friend, but we'll pick you up at Maghrib. When it's time to pick up the child, they ask to stay later, and then we get blamed for embarrassing them when the response is no. So that's okay. If the deal was Maghrib and they're embarrassed, then that's on them, because they knew what the deal was to begin with. And then they just need to sit with the feelings of embarrassment because they were pushing against a hard no boundary. And so it's okay. Remember, I said it's okay that you're not your child's friend. It's okay that they're going to be unhappy with you. Your job is to help them feel contained and safe. And that's not always going to be something that they like. And how you do that's not always going to be something that they like or appreciate. But that's okay. So for that, I'd hold on to my hard rule, and I'd say, the next time this happens, if you're going to push against the boundaries when the rules are very clear, then I don't think you can visit your friend again. There's another one. Parenting tips are consistent with secular liberal parenting ideas. I was looking forward to it from a more conservative, traditional Muslim worldview. How can we balance modern ideas with parenting? I really don't care for examples of a toddler falling to drug addiction, fornication, vaping, and other falling of modern teens. There needs to be more ways to prevent these major falls. Okay, so I don't know where the example of a toddler falling for a drug addiction, what that's about. But so essentially, I don't feel like when we talk about this relationship, it is, in some respects, it can be considered secular in that it's about a positivistic parenting approach that might be contrary to parents' own experiences of being parented. But I think, I don't think that it is not Islamic. It's not traditional to encourage your child to have a say in what's happening in their world, but I can understand that it might be perceived that way. So what this talk was about was not to encourage secular or non-traditional or liberal worldviews, but to maintain a relationship with your child, whatever that might be for you. So I'm not promoting a certain way of parenting. I'm saying to you that if you have this kind of relationship with your child, it is going to be better for you and for them developmentally. And how you want to have and how you create and navigate that relationship is up to you and your family. And what it's about is maintaining a connection, however that will be for you. So I don't necessarily think that it is, from my perspective, although I respect that you experience it as such, I don't necessarily see that that is liberal. But I respect that you might perceive it as such. Okay. So we're going to take a few more questions. I know we're out of time. Wasfia, should I take a few more?
Yes, you can go ahead. That's okay.
So my son is 14 years old, isn't allowed WhatsApp and social media. He's saying he's feeling left out because of his peers. How do I find a way around it? We can only trust so much and don't want to be seen as helicopter parents or police. So that's difficult because yes, there are peers. I mean, there are 9-10-year-olds on WhatsApp and social media, and it's important that you in your family decide what your rules are, and that's okay. Just for me personally, my 15 going on 16-year-old is not allowed to be on social media, and that's a rule that she pushes against. But what you need to do as parents is to, with your child, negotiate on what's okay and what's not. And so that was my rule that she pushes against all the time. And the deal is when she's 16, she can have an Instagram account, but for now she's on mine. You really need to negotiate that with your child, and you need to help your child understand that there's always going to be experiences of being left out. And what does it mean? And it can mean a lot for a teenager who wants to be a part of a bigger group, but what it means for you in terms of the risks that comes with an exposure to a certain way of engaging might be different. And so the risks outweighs the benefits of allowing them to engage on that platform. And that's something that you can discuss with them. So, okay, so then you can even have the conversation. So, okay, you're going to be allowed on WhatsApp, but these are the rules for that. That I'm going to randomly check the groups you're involved with, that I'm going to check your social media. And so you set the parameters for what's okay. And then you can say to him, these are the rules. These are the rules, and are you okay with that? Because these are the conditions for being on WhatsApp. So I have 3 teens between 14 and 19. I struggle with back chatting. It's so difficult because this generation is raised to share their voice and have voices and have opinions. I think what's important with that is respectfulness. And it is hard to not lose everything when they become cheeky. But what we need to teach them is that there's a respectful way of communicating, and there are ways that are okay and not okay when speaking to your parent. So, but they zone out and only hear you when you raise your voice or do not take note. How can you change it? So one way you can manage that is by talking about the different ways. The one way you can say is that I feel very disrespected when you talk to me that way. That isn't the way I want the relationship I want us to have. And when you talk to me that way, I'm going to walk away because it's not okay. And so you walk away and you don't allow that to happen. And you can say to them, when you're able to speak to me more respectfully, then I'll listen to you. And your child's going to eventually need you for something, and they can need you to listen to them for something, and use that as an opportunity to kind of backtrack on this respectful tone. They're going to need you, mommy, can you take me to the shop to buy whatever? And then you can say, well, it seems like you're able to talk to me respectfully now, and so then it's okay, I'll take it to the shop, but you need to be using your respectful tone more often, because if you don't use a respectful tone, then I might not listen to you, and I might not want to take you to the shop because I'd feel disrespected. How do you deal with a child that shuts down and doesn't deal with negative emotions? They feel like it doesn't exist. That's a difficult one. Sometimes children too shut down because it's overwhelming and they can't cope with it. They pretend it doesn't exist. How long do they pretend it doesn't exist for? If it's indefinitely and they're internalizing all their feelings, it will show up in some way. It may be that they become more irritable. It may be that they're not sleeping well, or they're not eating well. It's really important that that they be given a space where they can feel free to show their emotions. It might mean that it's not with you though. So sometimes our children are not comfortable for whatever reason sharing their emotions with you. It's important then that they have a trusted adult they can talk to. And if you find that it warrants therapy, that you can send them to therapy so that they're able to have someone and that they're not internalizing it. Because my worry with children who internalize is that it's going to show up in some way. And we want it to be a healthier processing of emotion rather than an unhealthy showing up through irritability or, and in some cases, that's really very real. For example, anxiety, where they're not coping at school. So we're going to take questions for 5 more minutes. I know there's a lot coming through, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to attend to all of these questions. I'd really encourage you to get the book, though, the one I shared earlier. Let's Talk Teen. You can read it and your teen can read it, but also to access resources. So there's lots of resources out there. I like the resources that have been shared by UNICEF. There are also support groups available through SADAG. If you Google it, there are support groups for teens. There are how to help parents manage teens. So there are different support networks and groups out there. If you find that what your child is presenting with is very serious and problematic, and no matter what you've tried, that you haven't been able to help them or support them to behave or differently or to get the support they need, I'd also encourage you to think about therapy, so that your teen can have an adult to speak to that is attuned, that's authentic and available to them, and that they learn then in that kind of space to manage their feelings differently. But I've said earlier, and I hold to it, that parents are the first line of defense. So if in the parental system you are able to offer the teen some of what I spoke about today, that can be most effective, actually. There's just one more. My son is always demanding and sometimes talks to us as if he's the parent. He's also disrespectful. How do we deal with this? You set the limits. So what is okay and what is not okay? So if he is demanding, do you give in to his demands, which is why he feels he can continue being demanding? Or do you say no? So it's also important that we think about setting the limits and not being liked. Sometimes they're not going to like us, and that's okay. But they need to know that that behavior is not okay, because if you think about it, especially during adolescence, right, we're preparing them for adults. What's going to happen if he shows up at university like that? People aren't going to meet his demands, and then how is he going to deal with it? What's going to happen if he goes to the work? So what you're doing is you actually, in some respects, when we don't limit and create boundaries for our children, we are disabling them for engagement in the bigger world, because they're not going to be allowed to get away with that, the behavior that we are allowing now. So set the limits and have consequences, and you can even talk about the consequences. So you are not the parent, we are, and this is our rules and this is our restrictions, and we won't comply or go along with what you're saying. If he's disrespectful, set limits and have consequences to this disrespect. Because like I say, he cannot go into the world. If he's disrespectful to his boss, is he going to still have the job? So you are teaching him how to engage in the broader world, I think. So I don't have time for any more questions, unfortunately. I hope that you were able to find. I feel like I rushed through this, and I really have to apologize for that. I need to be more mindful about how I put this together. Because actually what's most important about this is that whatever resonated with you with this talk, and you feel is something that you want to work on as a parent, what's most important is that you take that away and reflect on it and think about how you can do things differently. And I feel like when I overwhelm you with information, which is something of what I've done this evening, that's going to be very difficult to do. But inshallah, if I'm invited back to the space, I'll be more mindful about not overwhelming or including too much information so that parents aren't allowed a space for reflection. Inshallah, I hope this talk was useful for you. And if there's one thing you can take away from me, alhamdulillah, for me, that's enough. If it's just one thing, if it's just one person and one family or one team that's going to in some way benefit from this space, and then that's enough. Shukran for taking the time, more so than you put aside for this, and for bearing with me as I rambled through some of this information. Again, I hope it was useful. Take what works for you, discard what doesn't. Not everything's going to fit for you. You and your family decide what works for you and what doesn't work for you. You negotiate what your boundaries are and what your limits are as parents. What I was trying to do is just encourage a relationship. So shukran for attending, and I appreciate you staying with me for almost 2 hours now. I'll hand it back over to Asfiya.
Shukran so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. It was definitely very beneficial and helpful and informative. And alhamdulillah, there has already been some positive feedback on today's session. So we really would like to thank you for your time and sharing your expertise with us. And yes, we would definitely love to have like maybe a longer 4-week workshop on parenting in the near future, inshallah. And to our audience, if there are any specific topics you'd like us to cover, please contact us via WhatsApp, Instagram, or Facebook. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can catch up on previous webinars that we've hosted also on parenting and on other topics as well. So that is it from us for this evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and have a fantastic week ahead, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum.